They called it a home for the forgotten, but what they found inside was something the devil himself might have turned away from. In the sweltering summer of 1812, 30 miles northwest of Springfield, Illinois, the sun rose over a settlement blanketed in silence. At first, no one noticed the absence of laughter. No one questioned why the usual barefoot footsteps of children playing in the dust had vanished. But by the time the 45th child had died, one every 2 days for 14 weeks, something ancient and horrifying had already taken root. This was no epidemic. No fever burned through the lungs. No wounds bled from accidents in the fields. The deaths at Riverside Children's Home carried no trace of nature's hand. And when authorities finally arrived in late August, they found only 12 survivors, huddled together in the main hall like ghosts that had forgotten how to die. Their eyes were vacant. Their limbs bore strange marks, patterns, symbols, wounds that defied explanation. Not one could speak clearly of what had happened. And tucked into the last page of the magistrate's handwritten report, later buried in a locked archive for over 200 years, was one sentence: methods employed beyond Christian comprehension. The case was sealed, the building abandoned. The past, it seemed, would remain silent. Until 1987. That year, renovation workers clearing the basement of what had become a crumbling historical building made a discovery. Behind a false wall, long sealed and covered with soot, they found an iron chest. Inside, dozens of leather-bound journals, diagrams drawn in red ink, and pages describing rituals, controls, punishments, psychological procedures that had no place in a house meant for children. And at the center of it all was the name of one man, a man whose existence had been wiped clean from public record, a man who referred to himself not as a caretaker, but as a corrector. These documents revealed that the Riverside Children's Home had been used for something far more sinister than charity. The children were subjects. Their fears, their behaviors, their resistance, they were measured, manipulated, and ultimately broken. The methods employed were not primitive. On the contrary, they were frighteningly precise. Pain was timed. Sleep was restricted in patterns. Isolation was used as a tool not for discipline, but for reshaping identity. In one journal entry, the corrector writes, "The child is like wet clay, and like clay, it screams in a fire, but once set, it cannot change back." The community never knew. Not really. They whispered, yes, about the cold, about the silence, about the way birds stop singing when they pass a gate. But no one asked questions. No one wanted to believe that something like this could happen there, in a Christian land, in a town that sang hymns and buried its dead with scripture. And so the home was shuttered, the story suppressed. But pain has a strange way of leaving fingerprints. Even today, visitors to the memorial park that now stands on the land often report a heaviness, a pressure in the chest. Some say they hear crying beneath the wind. Others speak of a figure seen from the corner of the eye, tall, unmoving, always watching. Those journals, the ones uncovered in 1987, now rest in the hands of private researchers. Some claim they should be destroyed. Others insist they must be preserved as a warning. What became of the corrector is unknown. His last entry ends abruptly. "Tonight, the 12th child sees through me. It will be done soon." No grave has ever been found. No records remain of his trial or death. But if you ask the locals, those few who still remember the stories whispered by their grandparents, they'll tell you the man who ran Riverside never left. Not really. Once by a tomahawk just above his left eye, leaving a crescent-shaped scar that turned pale in the cold and never truly healed. He spoke softly, carried himself with an austere dignity, and rarely blinked. When Crane arrived at the Society's office in early December of 1811, frost still clung to the inside of the windows. The board had been in session for 5 hours without progress. He introduced himself simply. He said he understood hardship, that he was not afraid of death, cold, or isolation. He asked for no wage, only lodging and provisions. and he brought with him a letter and signed and undated recommending him as a man of moral clarity and extraordinary self-control. Desperate and without alternatives, the board accepted. Crane assumed control of Riverside on December 19, 1811. Within a week, the staff, 2 school teachers, and a groundskeeper resigned. One teacher later wrote in a letter to her sister that Crane walks like he's, followed by something he cannot name. The children stop talking when he enters. They look away, and at night there are sounds from the cellar. That letter, never sent, was found decades later hidden inside a hymnal at the abandoned Trinity Church in Athens, Illinois. What followed over the next 14 weeks would never be fully explained by official records. Children began dying on January 6th. At first, it was written off as fever, exposure, or the toll of malnutrition. But these children had been healthy days before, reading books, attending morning lessons, reciting psalms. Then came the bruises, long, symmetrical, unnaturally dark. Then the muteness, survivors who could no longer speak, not out of injury, but out of something far more terrifying. By mid-March, 45 children were dead, their names never published, their graves unmarked. When magistrates finally reached the home in late August, they found the hallways silent, the chapel desecrated with what one report cryptically referred to as reverse psalms burned into the altar cloth. Crane was gone. Not a trace, not a note, only a journal, bound in leather and sealed with twine, discovered hidden beneath a loose stone in the cellar. Its contents were never made public, but one archivist, decades later, wrote anonymously to a university professor in Ohio. The entries begin as sermons, then they become equations, then drawings. By the end, it is neither scripture nor madness. It is something older. What happened to Josiah Crane remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the American Midwest. But to those who have studied the case, one truth remains unshakable. Riverside was never meant to be a home. It was a vessel. And in 1812, something came through. The children of Riverside remember the winter of 1811, not as a season, but as a sentence. A transformation etched into bone and frost. Something changed the moment Josiah Crane walked through the gates. The warmth didn't just leave the building. It was dragged out, nailed shut behind him, and buried beneath the snow. All of that warmth, maternal care, soft blankets, hot broth at dawn, disappeared almost overnight. Crane's first act as administrator was to lock away the children's winter coats, issuing thinner garments he claimed would build their fire from within. Breakfast became sparse, oats and lukewarm water, a single slice of bread of a child completed morning drills without complaint. The schoolrooms were kept unheated, to train the mind to function under strain. Discipline became ritual. A child who cried was left outside, until the tears froze to their cheeks. One who refused to eat was made to clean the latrines with bare hands. These were not punishment in Crane's mind. They were lessons in endurance. The staff, few as they were, found themselves torn. Some quietly left under the guise of illness. Others stayed, convinced by Crane's impassioned sermons that they were forging a new kind of citizen. He spoke of Rome, Sparta, and the harsh rites of tribal warriorhood. Children, he would say, are the clay. Suffering is a fire that bakes them solid. But there were whispers. Children began to fall ill. Strange fevers, fingers blackening from frostbite. Crane forbade visits from local settlers or inspection by traveling preachers, citing risks of contagion. Letters home went unwritten, unsent, or mysteriously lost. One of the older boys, 12-year-old Eli Wharton, attempted to run away. He was found 3 days later by a trapper near the Sangamon River, barefoot, shivering, and delirious. The trapper, a Frenchman named Moreau, testified years later that the boy repeated only one phrase through cracked lips: "The walls breathe at night." By spring of 1812, 8 children were dead. Another 11 would die before autumn. The deaths were attributed to exposure, illness, or accident. Crane recorded each in his journal with clinical detachment. Child 14, failure to adapt. Territorial officials finally arrived that November, prompted by anonymous letters from a dismissed nursemaid who had made the treacherous journey to Springfield herself. What they found chilled them, deeper than any winter storm. The dormitories were silent, the surviving children pale and skeletal. Crane met the delegation in full military uniform, his limp more pronounced, yet his bearing unbroken. He showed no shame, only disappointment that his work had been interrupted. He was removed from his position within 24 hours, but no charges were filed. No trial was ever held. The children were dispersed quietly. The building shuttered, the record sealed. And as the Sayamon thawed the following spring, locals swore the winds that passed through the old limestone walls still carried the faint cries of children. And Josiah Crane, he vanished. Some say he headed west toward Missouri Territory, others that he died in the woods, frozen like the ones he tried to forge. But in the decade that followed, other institutions, other orphanages began reporting new headmasters who arrived with military posture, hard philosophies, and names that never quite matched their papers. And at night, the children would wake, shivering, to the same whispered question, "Do you feel the fire yet?" The children had been warned to keep silent. But on that freezing January morning in 1812, when the youngest, just 4 years old, collapsed into the snow and didn't rise again, a scream shattered the silence. It was not the scream of a frightened child, but the roar of a brutal system unraveling. Happening to us was not preparation, but something far more sinister, something we were not meant to survive. Crane's grip on Riverside grew tighter with each passing day. The routines became harsher. Mornings began before sunrise with cold water washes in the open courtyard, water drawn from the river, often still iced over at the edges. Children stood shivering, teeth chattering, as Crane walked among them, correcting posture, demanding silence, and occasionally tapping their bare feet with a cane if they moved. Disobedience or even hesitation was met with what Crane termed corrective exposure. Children made to kneel in the snow, arms raised overhead, for what he claimed were disciplined building intervals. If they cried, they were ignored. If they collapsed, they were labeled unfit. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Crane's obsession with what he called the breaking point. According to notes recovered decades later from his journals, he believed every child possessed a mental wall, one that had to be shattered for true, hardened spirit to emerge. And so he devised what he called trials. Children were selected seemingly at random. Some were made to carry buckets of stones up and down the hill behind the orphanage for hours. Others were forbidden to speak for days, or assigned to sleep alone in the unheated chapel. Once, Mary Patterson recalled, a boy named Eli was kept in the cellar for 2 days, with nothing but a crust of bread and a wool blanket soaked in water. He returned changed, quiet, vacant, compliant, and still no one outside knew. The Territorial Committee, having assigned Crane in desperation, had turned its attention elsewhere. Winter storms and uprisings along the frontier kept officials occupied, while correspondence from Riverside remained formal and reassuring. Crane wrote of disciplinary improvements, moral, progress, and elevated spiritual endurance. No one questioned his reports. But inside the walls, the children were being transformed, not into citizens, but into survivors. Some began mimicking Crane's tone and manner. Others turned cold and detached. The younger ones clung to each other in silence, learning quickly that affection was weakness, and weakness was punished. Yet despite it all, whispers of defiance began to spread. A stolen piece of bread passed from hand to hand, a blanket smuggled to a shivering child during a storm, and one journal kept him beneath a loose floorboard in the girls' dormitory, where Mary wrote, in trembling script, "One day they will know what he did to us here. He made a 6-year-old boy stand barefoot in the snow until he died, and he called it Preparation. This wasn't school anymore. It was a crucible designed by a broken man who believed suffering was salvation. What began as a tragic accident would soon spiral into something far darker. The death of young Thomas Brennan was not a wake-up call. It was a catalyst. Rather than soften his grip, Superintendent Crane tightened it. To him, Thomas's lifeless body lying in the snow was a sign of failure. It was a necessary sacrifice, proof that only the strongest would survive and the rest would perish as nature intended. From that night onward, Riverside stopped pretending to be an orphanage. The laughter of children was replaced by silence. Footsteps slowed, voices hushed, and the youngest children clung to each other in fear. Food rations were cut again. The cold tolerance exercises were extended, sometimes for hours. Illness swept through the halls like wildfire. And still, Crane called to progress. His journal, later found locked in the back of a desk drawer, paints a chilling portrait of a man convinced he was on a divine mission. Pain reveals potential. Comfort kills potential, he wrote. Each page read, like the doctrine of a cold, calculated cult, one where weakness was the only sin. Even more disturbing were the phrases he began using. Endurance is cleansing. Tears are poisons exiting. The soul, we make them worthy, or they die unworthy. And they did die, quietly, one by one. But the most haunting truth? The children didn't rebel. Not because they didn't want to, but because many of them began to believe Crane was right. After weeks of isolation, indoctrination, and deprivation, some saw Thomas not as a victim, but as an example. He wasn't strong enough. I must be stronger. That was a twisted mantra that now ruled Riverside. And what happened next would bury the place in infamy forever. The next name in Crane's logbook would belong to a girl. And this time, she wouldn't go quietly. She was only 9 years old when they locked her underground for being too kind. What kind of place punishes compassion with cold, darkness, and hunger? What kind of man sees suffering as salvation? As the icy winds of February clawed at the cracked windows of the Riverside facility, something far colder took hold inside its stone walls, a deep, calculated descent into institutionalized cruelty. The man orchestrating this descent, William Crane, was no longer a schoolmaster. He was a zealot, convinced he had been chosen to forge children into steel through suffering. He called it the Frontier, Readiness Protocol, a title that echoed with the sick precision of a military campaign. But this was no war. This was an annihilation of childhood. Phase 1 had already starved their bodies and frozen their spirits. 1 meal a day, no blankets, no fires, no warmth but what they could find in each other's shivering arms. And even that was soon forbidden. February ushered in Phase 2, labor conditioning. Children who had once held slates and chalk were now handed axes and buckets. At 5 years old, they hauled water from a frozen river. At 6, they scrubbed floors with ice-bitten fingers until their skin cracked and bled. But worse than the cold was the silence, because every groan of pain or whimper of hunger was considered weakness, a sign that they were failing, and failure had consequences. Crane's log from this time are chilling in their clarity. He wrote, subject E. Caldwell demonstrates. Misdirected nurturing behavior. Remedy, isolation. Emma Caldwell, just 9, had committed an unthinkable crime, giving her bread to a starving 5-year-old. For that, she was dragged by the arm and thrown into the root cellar, a place that smelled of mold and forgotten things. There were no lights, no fire, just a biting stone floor and the sound of her own breathing, slowing with each passing hour. For days, that's how long she stayed down there, alone, with no warmth, no food, no explanation but Crane's. Twisted lesson. That kindness made you weak, and weakness led to death. When Emma was finally pulled from the cellar, her lips were blue, her eyes vacant, and her spirit dimmed. But she did not cry. Not because she had grown stronger. No, because some part of her had gone silent. Forever. And still, This was only phase 2. The most terrifying part of Crane's plan had yet to begin. When the body breaks, it screams. But when the spirit breaks, it whispers, and then it vanishes. This is what Mary Patterson would write decades later, describing the moment Emma Caldwell was pulled from the cellar, her limbs stiff and purple, her eyes hollow and unfocused. The frost had taken her fingers, but something colder had taken her soul. The death of Martin Kowalski didn't come with screams. It came with silence, an unbearable, suffocating silence as his body finally gave in. His thin frame, long since stripped of fat and strength, lay crumpled on the ice-crusted bank of the river, the bucket still upright beside him, his lips blue, his cough wet with blood, his eyes half closed, as if he were already dreaming of release. He had been dying for weeks, and everyone knew it, except Crane. Or worse, Crane knew and didn't care. In his daily log, written with the precision of a surgeon but the soul of a machine, Martin's death was reduced to a line of analysis. Subject M. Kowalski failed to develop adequate survival instincts despite intensive preparation. Death resulted from insufficient will to overcome temporary physical discomfort. Protocol must be intensified for remaining subjects. No sorrow, no guilt, just a diagnosis of the dead. But to the children, especially the older ones, it was a revelation. Something shifted in their bones that day, colder than the wind outside and sharper than the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. It was the realization that their suffering wasn't training. It was execution, slow, methodical, justified by a man who had long since mistaken cruelty for care. Mary Patterson began watching Crane differently. So did Samuel Harrison, the quiet boy with shoulders too narrow for 15 but eyes too old for his years. Samuel had been at Riverside the longest. He had seen Crane break dozens of children before, turning giggles into silence, curiosity into compliance. But now, for the first time, he saw the pattern, and worse, the end game. Yet what could they do? The nearest town was 30 miles through wild terrain. They had no maps, no clothes for travel, no tools. Crane had locked everything away, boots, matches, even the heavy coats the children used to wear, before winter began. And they were weak, starving, conditioned to believe that their misery was not only necessary but deserved. Still, the seed of resistance had been planted. It would take time to grow. But Mary, Samuel, and a few others now carried something dangerous in their hearts. Doubt. As March crept in with bone-deep winds and skies that refused to soften, Crane initiated phase 3 of his protocol. And this time, it would not be hunger or cold that tormented the children. It would be fear, systematized, weaponized, engineered. Crane called it fear management training. The children would soon learn. Hunger gnaws at the belly, cold bites at the skin, but fear devours the soul. The snow never stopped falling at Riverside, but inside the children's home, something far colder was taking root, a silence so deep it devoured the sound of life and left only obedience and death. By the time April arrived, Riverside Children's Home no longer resembled anything human. The once flickering hope in the eyes of the children had turned to something else, something hollow and distant. Mary Patterson later described it as being alive in a body that had already made peace with dying. The temperature outside had climbed just above freezing, but the chill inside the walls remained bone, deep, not from weather, but from fear. Every breath carried the weight of Crane's doctrine. Every step, every glance had to be measured. Trust had been broken and weaponized. The children now policed each other, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Crane's log entries during this period read like the ramblings of a man who had abandoned humanity in favor of delusion. Subject group is exhibiting early signs of cohesion around shared hardship. Groupthink must be disrupted to maintain individual resilience. Introducing variable stressors tomorrow. Supervisors have been briefed. Variable stressors meant anything from depriving food to rotating night awakenings, forcing children to stand outside barefoot in the ice for hours while Crane walked among them, muttering quotes from military survival manuals as if reciting prayers. Emma, the girl who had once sung lullabies to the little ones during storms, now stared blankly at the wall. All day, she hadn't spoken since Martin's death. And then there was Mary, quiet, observant, and now determined, because somewhere deep inside her a flicker remained, something older than pain, something that refused to die quietly. She began recording Crane's routines in her mind. When he slept, when he left supply shed unlocked, how often he rotated the guard duties among the older children. Mary understood now. This wasn't training. This wasn't preparation for the frontier. This was ritualized execution. And if someone didn't act soon, there would be no one left to remember the truth. On April 12, 1812, the last child to see sunlight from the riverside camp collapsed at the gate, clutching a frozen crust of bread, whispering the word mercy. What followed was a silence so profound it seemed the forest itself was mourning. But behind that silence was a man who believed he was saving them. April had brought no mercy, only a more calculated cruelty. To outsiders, the warming weather might have seemed like a promise, a reprieve, a turning point, a whisper of survival. But inside the cold, crumbling stone walls of Riverside, warmth meant escalation. For John Crane, the deaths of winter were not tragedies. They were victories, proof that his theory was working, proof that the weak were being filtered out, that his vision of a future hardened by terror was taking shape. He recorded everything. In neat military script, his April 1st log declared, winter conditioning successful, 8 eliminated, phase 4 initiated, resource competition now active. It sounded clinical, clean, but what it meant was this. 39 children, ages 5 to 13, were now pitted against one another in a war for survival orchestrated by the very man meant to protect them. Each day, children were forced into battle, not with weapons, but with hunger. Water, shelter, even tattered blankets were withheld unless their team won. Crane called it resource competition training. The winning group would be fed. The rest would go without, sometimes for days. Other times, longer. The results were devastating. Hollow-eyed and trembling, children began stealing from each other. Trust evaporated. Loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. And yet, something Crane had not predicted began to grow in the cracks of his cruelty. Defiance, led by Mary Patterson, a 12-year-old who had once been too timid to speak, above a whisper, a secret. Alliance began to form. Older children began hiding crusts of bread in their sleeves. Younger ones were tucked into corners during inspections. Water was shared. Wounds were treated in secret. They called it the circle, and though it was fragile, it was enough to keep some children alive. Crane discovered it by accident. A child caught sharing food under a floorboard confessed everything. His name was Peter. He was 6. That night, Crane's log read, evidence of insubordination confirms existence of unauthorized survival. Group, rebellion management protocols activated. The next morning, Peter was gone, and the silence in the barracks was no longer from fear. It was mourning. The first screams came not from fear, but confusion. Small voices asking why the food was gone. Why? Their friends were forced to fight. Why Emma was being tied down. And when no answers came, only commands, they understood something no child should ever know. That kindness was now treason and mercy, a punishable offense. She was denied all food and water, forced to remain outdoors through cold April nights with no covering. Each morning, Crane would summon the children to observe her suffering in what he called resilience. Lectures. As Emma's body grew weaker, the lecture became more cruelly performative. Crane would demand the children recite phrases like, "Weakness is death," while Emma lay shaking before them. When she could no longer sit up, he forced 2 boys to hold her upright, punishing them if they faltered. By the 5th day, Emma's breathing had grown shallow, her eyes distant, but Crane insisted the ritual continue. On the seventh day, April 29th, she died in the early morning. Her body was left lying in the center yard for nearly 24 hours while the children were ordered to continue their activities around it. Crane's log entry that evening read simply, "Subject E terminated. Resistance model neutralized. Psychological effect on remaining subjects. Promising." What followed was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Even the youngest children no longer cried. They moved mechanically, speaking only when spoken to, eyes dull and afraid to make contact. Crane mistook this for success. He believed he had forged strength. What he had done was something far more monstrous. He had shattered their humanity. But beneath the surface, something else had begun to take root. The memory of Emma's death, of the way she endured without once begging Crane for mercy, became a symbol of quiet defiance. The underground network Mary Patterson had formed grew stronger, more secretive, and for the first time, even some of Crane's most loyal monitors, children he had selected to report on others, began to question the purpose of his rules. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and Emma, even in death, had become their first martyr. They were not students. They were experiments. He didn't build a school, he built a crucible. And in that crucible, the weak didn't fail, they died. By the spring of 1812, the walls of Riverside were no longer just boundaries. They were a prison built from silence, fear, and the slow erosion of childhood. What had begun as a hopeful frontier orphanage under the tender hands of Miss Hartwell had, in less than a year, become a machine for psychological annihilation under the command of a man named Elias Crane. The children no longer looked like children. Their eyes held the weight of the dead in their shoulders, the burden of those still trying to live. But it wasn't the starvation or the cold that broke them. It was what Crane called terminal conditioning. Emma Caldwell was 7 years old, gentle, quiet, and already half-starved when she became the first official subject of Crane's darkest experiment. Her only crime, weakness, and in Crane's eyes, weakness was contagious. She was denied food, water, human touch. Each night, she was locked in a wooden box, barely large enough for a small frame, and left outside, under the stars, where frost painted its silent warnings across the rough pine boards. And still, she survived, for 7 days. 7 days of systematic torture, all carefully documented in Crane's leather-bound ledger like clinical notes from a butcher. The children, those who had once played with her, shared stories, songs, and tears, were forced to watch, because to show compassion was to be next. Emma died on April 29th, and that day, something else died with her, hope. Mary Patterson, only 10, would later testify. We realized that Mr. Crane wasn't making us stronger. He was killing us, one by one, and making us part of the killing. But Crane wasn't finished. He had begun preparations for what he called graduation protocols. Those who failed wouldn't be corrected. They would be erased permanently. By summer, only 12 would remain. The rest? Final conditioning. And the worst part? Crane believed he was saving them. They were children, hungry, shivering, huddled in corners like ghosts in their own skin. And yet, each morning, fewer woke up. The man who held the key didn't see them as children, but as test subjects. And graduation meant death. By the end of May 1812, the final horror of Riverside began to take shape. Mr. Crane's journals, written in careful, almost reverent script, described the children not as humans, but as evolving organisms under stress. To him, the starvation was resource adaptation. The silence was emotional stability. And the deaths? Necessary eliminations. Subjects show excellent adaptation to resource limitation, he wrote coldly. Average weight loss of 23 to 31% has eliminated excess body mass while maintaining functional capacity. But behind the sterile words was a truth too brutal for most to speak aloud. The children had learned that emotion was lethal, that showing compassion meant punishment, that caring for the weak meant you became next. Mary Patterson, now an old woman when she gave her testimony, remembered those days like waking up inside a nightmare that never ended. We had stopped being children, she whispered. When someone died, we felt nothing. Feeling anything hurt too much. We had become exactly what Mr. Crane wanted, empty things that could endure anything. In his final phase, what he called endurance testing, Crane implemented trials designed not for education but extermination. He forced children to stand waist-deep in the freezing current of the river until they blacked out from hypothermia. He starved them for days, then made them carry heavy stone loads across the compound. He beat them to the brink of death, just to see how much they could take. 9 children died in May alone. But even this wasn't the end. Crane, now fully consumed by his delusions, feared the survivors were still clinging to each other. That in some hidden corner of their shattered hearts, they still had the capacity to love. And so he initiated the loyalty confirmation protocols. He ordered children to inform on each other, to identify those who wept at night, who held hands when they thought no one was watching, who buried the dead with care instead of leaving them to rot. Those identified were not punished. They were erased. To Crane, loyalty meant isolation. Trust was weakness. And the only survivors were the ones who could extinguish every last flicker of human warmth. And so, under the blazing summer sun, 31 children became shadows of themselves. Not educated. Not transformed. Just broken. And soon, only 12 would remain. 12 hollow-eyed survivors, shaped by a nightmare so dark, history tried to bury it. But the truth always finds a way to speak, especially when it's written in the blood of the innocent. They called it school, but what happened inside its walls was not education. It was experimentation, and the children were the lab rats. David Murphy did not cry. He did not speak. He simply stood there, knife clenched, blood dripping from his fingers, and a hollow vacancy in his eyes that no child should ever carry. When Mary Patterson looked into David's face that day, she later said it was as if his soul had crawled away and left only skin and bone behind. Crane made no secret of what he was doing anymore. He wasn't just studying survival. He was manufacturing monsters, redefining loyalty not by compassion or courage, but by a child's ability to mutilate innocence in the name of obedience. Each excellence competition stripped away the final remnants of humanity. The children no longer spoke in full sentences. They did not look each other in the eye. They stopped dreaming. Some stopped sleeping altogether, fearing what they might be forced to do or become by the next morning. By mid-June, 5 more children were gone. The remaining 7 were pale shadows of what they once were. Emotions had become liabilities. Friendships meant betrayal. Empathy was a death sentence. Crane had inverted every moral law, every natural instinct, until survival meant submission and silence meant safety. What he didn't anticipate was the one instinct he couldn't completely erase: hope, a spark buried so deep it couldn't be beaten or starved out. And in the darkest hour of that June, when Crane believed he had sculpted his perfect soldiers, that spark began to burn. What would you do if the only way to live was to kill your only friend? In June of 1812-14, children were given that choice. 7 rooms, 7 pairs, 1 meal, and 24 hours to decide who deserved to survive. Most never made it past dawn. The psychological torture of forcing children to choose between starving together or murdering one another was beyond anything previously recorded in institutional abuse. These weren't impulsive punishments or the breakdown of a madman's control. These were engineered moral annihilations, designed with surgical cruelty to transform children into obedient instruments of death. Crane's resource elimination testing was a masterpiece of sadistic philosophy. No threats, no screaming, just silence, the weight of starvation, and decision-making pressed like iron bars around them. The pairs were not random. Crane selected each duo based on their emotional closeness, best friends surrogate Siblings, children who protected one another through beatings and cold nights. Now, those bonds became the very instruments of betrayal. In room 6, 2 girls, Isabel and Grace, had been inseparable since their arrival in January. Their whispered promises to always watch out for one another were tested when the meager ration sat, untouched between them for hours. By nightfall, Isabel had curled into a fetal position, weeping quietly. Grace just stared at the food. She hadn't cried all day. At dawn, when Crane opened the door, only Grace was breathing. The food was gone. In Crane's journal, the incident was marked with a single sentence. Subject 34 demonstrated superior initiative and strategic detachment. Promoted to Tier 2 evaluation. This wasn't education. It was the industrialization of evil. The children were being forged into something new, beings without conscience, loyalty, or love. And 4. Crane, that was the point. The perfect student was the one who could kill without hesitation, eat without remorse, and follow orders without questioning why. By June 28th, only 10 children remained. They were no longer orphans. They were survivors of a blood ritual masked as a leadership program. And, in the eyes of Marcus Crane, they were ready for the final phase. But history had other plans. The children called it the Week of Hollow Eyes, when Mercy died and the last fragments of innocence were burned alive in front of their friends. Starving, terrified, and mentally fractured, the children at Riverside were no longer learning. They were being erased and rewritten. In Crane's warped philosophy, what he was building wasn't a school, but a crucible. Only the emotionally extinct would survive his curriculum. Of the 14 remaining children, 5 committed the unthinkable, taking the lives of their closest companions to survive the resource elimination testing, not with guns, not with knives, but with bare hands, stones, and strangulation. Crane observed everything, scribbling insights into his black journal like a man discovering the laws of nature, not the ruins of a soul. But even in hell, flickers of humanity refused to die quietly. Catherine Walsh, 13, frail, with a stammer and hair like sunlit copper, survived only because the boy paired with her, little Peter, chose starvation over violence. In his final hours, Peter held her hand and whispered, "Don't let him turn you into him." Timothy Brooks, barely 11, with a limp from an old injury, saw his partner hang himself rather than harm another child. Crane viewed their survival as a failure, not a miracle. And in his mind, failures needed to be expunged publicly. What came next was not just murder. It was a ritual of emotional annihilation. Catherine's torment was methodical. For 4 days, the children were forced to watch as she was broken. Her screams were ignored. Her name was stripped away. Crane called her Subject 12. No food. No water. And as her body collapsed under the weight of brutality, the other children were told that tears would earn them the same fate. Mary Patterson, who would later testify against Crane, described Catherine's final moments with the numb horror of someone who had long since lost the ability to grieve. She couldn't scream anymore. Her voice was gone. Her body was just a thing he used to make us obedient. And when she finally stopped breathing, we were relieved. We were actually relieved. And that was the point. Crane hadn't just killed a child. He had murdered the very idea of compassion and made the survivors thank him for it. But this was not the end. No. What came next would make the Week of Hollow Eyes feel merciful by comparison. You are not supposed to know this. No one was. But someone survived. Someone who saw it all. Who risked everything to stop what was meant to spread like a disease across America's forgotten frontier. Her name was Mary Patterson, and this is the story the Illinois Territory tried to erase. At first, they thought Timothy Brooks might be spared. He was obedient, sharp, and, perhaps most importantly, quiet. But Dr. Jeremiah Crane wasn't interested in obedience alone. He wanted transformation, submission so complete that it erased identity, memory, and morality. Timothy's end didn't come quickly. It wasn't just murder. It was a ritual designed to annihilate the soul of every witness. Crane forced the remaining children, 7 in total, to take part in the killing. Each was ordered to inflict a specific injury on Timothy. They were told this was part of a leadership development exercise. Those who refused would suffer terminal conditioning immediately. No room for conscience. No room for fear. Just blood. They obeyed, not out of cruelty, but survival. One by one, trembling hands carried out Crane's commands, breaking bone, drawing blood, watching as Timothy slipped away over hours of unbearable agony. Crane wrote it, all down in his log. He called it complete moral restructuring. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. By the time Timothy died on June 30th, the 7 survivors were hollow-eyed shells. But Crane considered them his masterpiece, completely conditioned specimens, he wrote, ready for field implementation. Crane believed he had unlocked a formula to create superior humans by breaking children into submission. On July 1st, he wrote, "Final selection phase complete. Subjects demonstrate total compliance. Program ready for territorial expansion." He had already drafted letters to local authorities, proposing his protocols for every charitable institution in the territory. He imagined schools filled with children trained to kill, to obey, to extinguish all weakness. This wasn't an orphanage anymore. It was a factory, a breeding ground for monsters made in his image. But what Crane didn't anticipate, what no log entry could predict, was Mary Patterson. She had survived every test. The starvation, the cold, the psychological dissection. She had screamed, silently, smiled when she wanted to cry, and nodded while her heart bled. She survived by becoming invisible until the moment invisibility wouldn't save anyone anymore. On July 15th, Crane told them they'd be traveling to Springfield. 3 of them would be showcased as successful outcomes. The other 4 would die in front of officials as proof that Crane's methods worked. It was to be the grand unveiling of a doctrine built on suffering. That night, Mary made her choice. As Crane pored over his notes, dreaming of a future built on pain, Mary slipped from her locked dormitory, moving like a shadow through the rotting halls of Riverside. She had memorized the guard's pattern. She knew where he slept. She had watched him snore through screams. Inside Crane's office, she found it, the black ledger. 40 names, 40 deaths, plans for hundreds more. Crane hadn't just recorded what he'd done. He had created a blueprint for hell. Mary didn't flinch. She took the log, stole a coat, and vanished into the dark. 30 miles of wilderness stretched between her and Springfield. Wolves howled. The wind tore at her skin. But she didn't stop, because somewhere out there, other children were still alive. And Mary Patterson had become something Crane never imagined. The survivor, the witness, the reckoning. And now, finally, so are you? They were children locked away in the woods, starved, beaten, and taught to kill, not by monsters, but by men who claimed it was for the future of America. And one of them fought back. But it wasn't just an attack. It was a spark. Samuel Harrison's trembling hands, stained with the blood of what he'd become, held the blade with more fear than fury. But it was enough. Enough to shake the air. Enough to disrupt the silence of that haunted facility. Crane, ever the predator, subdued Samuel within seconds, his body hardened by years of military brutality. But the moment had cracked the spell of fear. It gave Mary Patterson the second she needed to, ripped free from her restraints, blood dripping from her wrists, eyes sunken but burning. She wasn't alone. 2 others, Sarah Moore and Calvin James, moved like phantoms through the room, snatching anything they could use as a weapon. The children, long broken, had been watching, and now they remembered they had once been human. What followed was chaos, a ragged resistance erupting like wildfire. Crane, surrounded by children he, once molded like clay, now faced the jagged remains of his failed godhood. The facility erupted into violence not of Crane's design, but of desperation. Screams filled the wooden halls. not the screams of conditioning but rebellion. Some of the children didn't make it out. Many were too weak, too fractured. But Mary, Samuel, Sarah, and Calvin, bruised, burned, and barely alive, burst through the rear maintenance hatch, running into the wilderness of Michigan like hunted animals. The fire that destroyed the Riverside institution that night was no accident. Weeks later, when law enforcement finally acted, urged on by the testimonies of Mary and the surviving children, they uncovered something darker than any had feared. Crane's journals, his coded letters, his methodical philosophy of child transformation, and the names of others. The fire cleansed the grounds. But the rot, it ran deep in the walls of Riverside. And to this day, no one knows how many institutions follow the same blueprint. No one knows how. Many Cranes still walk free. But one thing remains carved into blackened earth where that facility once stood. He broke us to build a future. We burned it to save our souls. July 1812, a young girl, covered in blood and barefoot, stumbled onto a rural road in Springfield, whispering a name over and over again, Crane. When the militia followed her trail back to the orphanage, what they found inside would haunt America's conscience forever. Children shouldn't have to be brave. They shouldn't have to survive what Mary Patterson endured. But inside the cold brick walls of Riverside Children's Home, bravery became the only thing that stood. Between life and death, Crane's reign didn't end with blood. It began with obsession. His journal, meticulously kept in a leather-bound book, was filled with twisted entries, methods of terminal conditioning, emotional extinction cycles, and his theory that trauma bred resilience. But more chilling than his theories were the letters he received. Dozens of them, some sealed with wax, others crudely marked in blood like ink. They weren't from strangers. No, these were territorial leaders, educators, even missionaries, all discussing how Crane's methods could be scaled. Crane believed he was forging future pioneers. Instead, he was building a tomb. When Mary attempted to escape with his documents, she wasn't running for herself. She was trying to save the next generation of victims. But her capture that night sealed the fate of dozens. Crane's paranoia was ignited. His July 17th journal entry said it plainly. All subjects will undergo terminal conditioning. Replacement subjects will be acquired. That's when the silence broke. Samuel Harrison, one of the loyal pawn in Crane's horrors, turned on his master. His final act of defiance, plunging a kitchen knife into Crane's back, allowed Mary, Lucy, and Robert to slip into the cold darkness beyond the orphanage walls. Samuel died for children he barely knew. Mary crawled for miles, bones broken, skin torn from lashings. She held Lucy in one arm and kept whispering to Robert, "Don't stop walking." When the patrol found them, Mary had passed out, but she still clutched Crane's blood-soaked journal. Inside Riverside, Crane sat waiting, calm, deluded, ready to be congratulated for his work. Instead, he was arrested, tried, and executed. But the shadows of his deeds still whisper through history. 45 children dead, a dozen others permanently damaged, and a network of institutions revealed, all infected with the same monstrous belief that suffering builds character. Mary's testimony, preserved in the archives, remains one of the most disturbing yet powerful records of survival in early American history. And it asks us one simple question. What happens when a society values toughness more than innocence? They thought it was thunder. But what the townspeople actually heard on the edge of that cold October night in 1842 was something else entirely. A sharp crack echoed across the prairie, followed by a second, softer sound. It wasn't till dawn that anyone approached the old Riverside Children's Home. By then it was too late. Inside the stone-walled dormitories, authorities discovered a scene so harrowing that several officials resigned the very next day, unable to speak of what they had seen. 45 children, starved, bruised, arranged like specimens, and one man, smiling in silence, as if the chaos had proven a point only he understood. His name was Elijah Crane, but what they uncovered was far bigger than one man. As investigators dug deeper, they began to expose a broader network of institutional abuse. The Riverside Children's Home was permanently closed, and though the building was demolished in 1847, it remained untouched for decades prior. When renovation crews arrived in 1987, they discovered records hidden behind loose bricks, documents that revealed the home had been silently abandoned, haunted not just by time but by memory. Locals had long whispered about strange sounds and unexplained sightings, and, while skeptics dismissed the claims, the psychological scars left by Riverside were very real. Mary Patterson's testimony, extracted during a closed-door tribunal, led to reforms in territorial governance and child welfare inspections. But Crane's shadow extended farther than anyone imagined. Despite the public outrage, the full extent of Crane's network was never fully revealed. Historians believe his methods inspired similar atrocities across the frontier. Dr. Elise Chun, a forensic psychologist, spent years studying Crane's writings. Her chilling conclusion: Crane wasn't merely a sadist, he was an ideological terrorist. His mission was clear: break the child to build the human. His final entries read like scientific observations, cold and calculated. Program concludes today. 45 eliminated, 3 demonstrate. Enhance survivability. To Crane, this was not murder. It was method. What's most terrifying isn't just what he did. It's that he believed he was right. His final words before execution, a formal plea to institutionalize his work. Crane never flinched, never wept, never confessed. This isn't just a horror story. It's a warning. When ideology replaces empathy, monsters wear uniforms and carry clipboards. The children at Riverside didn't die in silence. They were silenced by a system that valued structure over soul. What do you think? Did the documents uncover everything? Or is there more buried in the dust of forgotten homes? Leave your thoughts below. If this story haunted you, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with someone who believes history is just dates and names, because sometimes it screams in the dark. See you in the next video.